Well, Molly Worthen, great to have you on the podcast. You wrote a book called Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Okay, what a span of time. It's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
I am kind of curious, we were talking before we started recording that you're talking to a largely post-evangelical, ex-evangelical, new evangelical audience, people who grew up in like the Christian tradition in some way, shape, or form. This book, even in the subtext, when I think about Puritans, I think about Christianity in some way, shape, or form. Is your background also somewhere there, or did you grow up religious at all?
No, I grew up in a totally secular household.
Wow.
But my story is a little bit unusual in that I am a very recent convert to evangelical Christianity. I, I have
Really?
I have told the internet this story if people want the long version, but
Huh.
the short version is about 3 years ago. I set out to write a magazine profile of a local Southern Baptist megachurch pastor, and he evangelized me, and so here I am.
And it
I go
worked.
to I go to a Raleigh Baptist megachurch, but my background is
Wow.
totally secular.
Okay, I feel like that's a whole different discussion that maybe one day we can have. I'm so curious about that journey for you. And by the way, congrats. I'm hopefully you're finding, a sense of all the things that I think Christianity at its best can give. Community, belonging, all that stuff. So I'm really happy for you. That's great. But wow, I was not ready for that plot twist. So that's super cool and super awesome. So then, why this book? I mean, the term charisma, I got to be honest, not really a term I use a whole lot, but as I read the subtext, I'm thinking, yeah, there is a sense of charisma to Trump, whether I like it or not, that seems compelling for some people. So what was the history behind this book?
In roughly 2015, 2016, I think like a lot of people, I was looking at the American political landscape and trying to make sense of this dynamic where this very singular political figure seemed to appeal in such an intense way to a huge swath of the country while being pretty repellent to another large swath of the
Yeah.
country. And so I was really struck by that dichotomy and what is the phenomenon in this individual that is eliciting both of those reactions, and are those reactions kind of two sides of the same coin? And then
Mm,
on top of that, I'm a student of religion, and for generations, I think those of us who study religion and write about religion have relied on some kind of go-to metrics to track what's happening in people's religious beliefs and practices, right? So, social scientists and historians and journalists pay a lot of attention to things like rates of church attendance,
mhm.
what people tell pollsters when they call up and say, "What's your religious affiliation?" And
Right.
we know that, over the last generation, a bit more, those numbers have, with some exceptions, been generally declining. But my sense has always been, my whole career, that humans are, in a pretty fundamental way, religious creatures. We have
Mm,
this impulse to connect ourselves to a transcendent picture of the world. We have an impulse to worship. And those impulses, I don't think, disappear just because those statistics decline. And so my question was, okay, if that religious impulse is no longer landing quite so often in church, it's landing somewhere. And maybe
yeah.
one place it's landing is in this relationship between charismatic leaders and followers. So that was my hypothesis going into the project.
That honestly, that does make sense. I think about I was taught in my evangelical tradition that everyone worships something. That was kind of their way of saying what you just said in a more layman's way. Like, the idea is that humans do tend to find ways to idolize someone or something, or tend to organized around something or someone. And I agree. I mean, I think even if you leave organized religion behind, there's still something about the human experience and human need that says, what can I be a part of that makes me feel like I'm tied to something bigger than myself, maybe, right? And so that makes a lot of sense, because you're right. I mean, as someone who's interviewed a lot of those scholars and sociologists and historians, right, we've been trying to make sense of, how did Trump become this thing that is, it's honestly, I'm just speaking truthfully from my perspective. It is really hard to understand. And I'm someone who grew up, very evangelical, I was homeschooled the whole nine. And when Trump came on the scene, I'm like, I don't understand the appeal, especially with white evangelicals around this guy, because he just embodies so many things that I was taught were like not what God or the Bible would really be cool with, right? So that's your hypothesis. What did you discover as you were researching for the book?
Well, I'm trying to tell in the book a story that spans 4 centuries, and therefore,
Yeah,
pays a fair amount of attention to the current moment, but without letting the current moment kind of take over. I didn't want to let the current political moment totally shape my approach to the deeper history, because I think it's a real danger, especially when we have a pressing kind of political conundrum we're trying to explain that really activates people. So what I found was really a story of continuity. I mean, I think
Hmm.
we tend to maybe flatter ourselves or feel sorry for ourselves as residents of the 21st century, and we think that our moment is very strange and special in all kinds of ways, and to some extent that's true, right? So
Sure.
we do have an unprecedented media landscape,
Yep.
but I think that perhaps we exaggerate the degree to which the sort of basic dynamics of human social organization and human impulses and desires have been totally revolutionized by the rise of the internet and social media. So I think I wanted to push back past the age of modern mass media, and also look at the entanglement of the story of two kinds of charisma, right? Because this word really has two meanings. I mean, originally it comes from the ancient Greek, charis, the sense of divine anointing, gift from the gods for good or for ill. It's a word that the New Testament writers turn into charisma, adding that suffix ma, which in the Greek puts the emphasis on the end state, and it means, if you look especially at the way Paul uses it, a range of things, from the kind of general gift of grace of salvation to the specific gifts that perhaps we associate with Pentecostal practices today, speaking in tongues and healing and so forth.
Hmm.
And that's really what the term meant for most of the past 2 millennia, until the sociologist Max Weber borrowed that word from the context of biblical studies and church history around the turn of the 20th century,
Hmm.
and repurposed it to try to explain this kind of ineffable magnetism that some leaders have with their followers. And so it's really to Weber that we owe the kind of colloquial sense that we use the term charisma today when we're talking about a political or a religious leader who has this kind of baffling hold on his or her followers. But my thought was that those two histories are intertwined. I mean, even when Max Weber tried to kind of take the word and make it okay for his respectable secular social scientist colleagues to use it, he didn't totally erase from it every kind of theological dimension. He still talks about it in terms of kind of a supernatural set of powers and gifts that this leader must have, or must persuade his followers that he has. So, I went back and I started in kind of the aftermath of the Reformation,
Hmm.
because to me there's something important that happens there in the history of the West. There's this way in which the medieval Catholic Church had certain ways of managing the human desire for direct contact with the divine,
Hmm.
a direct line to the Holy Spirit. They had sort of checks and balances in the hierarchy that more or less worked for a very long time,
Yeah.
and that breaks down in the course of the Reformation. And the Reformation releases this. It makes possible all kinds of end runs, you could say, around the usual hierarchies of institutional authority, because that's really what distinguishes charisma from other kinds of authority. It doesn't depend on a leader having a particular place in an institution, or
Hmm.
the credibility associated with tradition. It
Huh.
can go along with those things, but it doesn't require them. And so I found myself starting really in Puritan Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s, and the story of probably the most famous heretic of Puritan Boston, Anne Hutchinson, who becomes very critical of the magistrates and the ministers, and says, they are telling you that you need to be parsing your diary every night and looking for evidence that you are prepared for election if God chooses you, and you have to exist in kind of this state of uncertainty. But I'm telling you that you can expect direct assurance from the Holy Spirit that you are saved. Now, that's a very Puritan, very Calvinist way of talking that sounds very foreign if we, zoom forward to the 20th, 21st century. But I think there is a kernel there that we can trace all the way through, because in that desire for what the Puritans call divine assurance, there's a kind of paradoxical hunger for, on the one hand, a sense of security, that like a force bigger than me has got it
Yes.
sorted out, but also a desire for empowerment, for a confirmation that, as I kind of muddle through my life of suffering and sorrow and chaos, actually I have a way of seeing it that makes all the pieces fit together and makes it make sense and gives me a sense of control. So it's this kind of paradoxical desire of security and freedom that I think is the sort of secret sauce that charismatic leaders all the way down through the centuries, both in the context of religion and in the context of more secular politics, provide their followers. And that's really the through line that I trace, going through some of the kind of the more famous figures, the presidents I write about, from Andrew Jackson to FDR to JFK, to maybe less expected figures like 19th century spiritualist trance speakers and some of the cult leaders of the 1970s, the pioneers of modern leadership studies and business schools, right? For me, there is this through line. It's kind of surprising, but there are certain things that have not really changed about our hungers and anxieties over the centuries.
Huh. Wow. I mean, geez, that's awesome. That's really thought-provoking stuff. I can tell you, as someone who has interviewed a lot of folks, I never thought about that or had someone on the show talk about things like this before, but it's really helpful because as you're talking, I'm like kind of putting pieces together, like, oh, this can help us make sense of just different things. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the people that you write about and that you studied, do you think that they know they had like this charisma that was able to compel people to do certain things, or was it something that they were born with or that they were able to work at? Like, what is it that goes into, like, what are some of the ingredients that go into this thing that makes people find other folks super compelling for one reason or another?
I think often these figures had a sense of their own capacity, and the exact ingredients are not, I think they reflect the particular anxieties and fears of the age. I mean, what I found is that a successful charismatic leader learns and perhaps has some innate instinct for telling a more compelling story,
Mm-hmm.
inviting followers into a story about their lives, about its transcendent meaning, what roles they can play, what roles the leader is playing, that is more compelling than the other stories on offer in the culture. And exactly what that looks like depends on the historical context.
Sure.
So, I think that the rise of a charismatic leader is, it's a kind of balance between response to big picture historical patterns, as well as the gifts and idiosyncrasies of the individual leader himself. Whether we're thinking about Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, who had this instinct, I think, for what would for exactly how far he could stand from the traditions and institutions of his time, to challenge them and appeal to people who were kind of frustrated with the post-Puritan kind of still, fairly Calvinistic theology of New England and upstate New York in the early Republic, while not standing so far away from, the language of the King James Bible and the kind of the references of the biblical tradition, that he would seem totally alien and just wouldn't be able to get any purchase on the culture. So he had an instinct for and Mormons would say this is divine inspiration, right? I
Yep.
think you can tell the story in a way that is either believing or more skeptical. But he had an instinct for telling a story that in many ways addressed a lot of the frustrations people had with kind of the paradoxes of traditional Orthodox Christianity, right? If you're really just feeling ground down by the story of predestination, and you're
Mm-hmm.
confused by the relationship between your own free will and divine sovereignty. Well, Joseph Smith's proposal is essentially the ultimate free will faith that intersected in a masterful way with the evolving ideology of manifest destiny that is so powerful in the era of the early republic. I mean, we forget this about the Mormon faith today, but in its first couple of decades, it was really focused on evangelizing and assimilating indigenous peoples, much more so than, like, we think of, weren't all the Christian groups like interested in missions? Yes, to some extent, but the Mormons had a particular vision for how indigenous peoples fit into their broader cosmology. I mean, the
Hmm.
first edition of the Book of Mormon had, as part of its subtitle, a message to the Lamanites, which is the name of the ancestor people group in the Book of Mormon that Mormons believe were among the ancestors of today's Native Americans. And so they have this story of kind of lost tribes of Israel, essentially, that gave rise to the peoples of this continent, that gave early Mormons this special mandate. And in fact, early Mormons spoke in tongues, right? So this is where
Hmm.
that story of New Testament charisma gets woven into the story of charisma in the more political leadership sense. And they spoke in tongues, what are reported in the sources as kind of sounds that resembled pidgin attempts at indigenous languages, because they believed this was the Holy Spirit equipping them to reach the Native Americans of their time. So, I think
Wow.
I think this helps us see how Joseph Smith and the ideas and practices that he was nurturing spoke in a very particular way to the anxieties and the kind of ideas about authority, what would count as evidence, right? He was masterful in collecting early groups of friends and colleagues of his who served as witnesses, who signed affidavits saying that they had handled the golden plates and they could attest that this was true. So
Hmm.
he was able to kind of guide potential converts in this dance of kind of skepticism and credulity. I think humans want to feel that they've made a decision to kind of jump over the line, right? That they've
Yeah.
really taken charge of their destiny. They've evaluated this offer, this invitation into a story, and here they're entering it. And Smith had a gift for coaxing people through that. And I think we can find similar patterns and a similar sensitive relationship to the era as we go through the centuries and trace these charismatic leaders.
So it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. That's why I have guests on the show. But it sounds like charisma is a neutral term, and it can be used for really positive things or negative things. Or am I missing that? Like, how do you think about charisma being used throughout? You document it through a pretty long span of history in one book. Do you have examples of, like, hey, this is when charisma is used in ways that actually do a lot of harm, versus, like, this is when charisma is used in ways to actually mobilize people to do a lot of good?
I really appreciate that question, because I think we have a tendency to use charisma in a very loaded way. Either
Right.
we use the term as a synonym for charm, and
Mm.
then it seems like it's automatically always a positive thing, or we use it to describe, to imply that a leader is being manipulative, there's something illegitimate about his or her claim to authority. And you perceive correctly. I am trying to suggest in the book that charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. I mean, it's kind of like the law of gravity. Like, the law of gravity has no built-in, moral valence. I think
Mm.
charisma is just sort of a dynamic that exists in how humans organize themselves, and it can absolutely be used for good or for ill. And I think the key is the extent to which the news story that the charismatic leader is presenting maps onto empirical reality that potential
Right.
followers can access through other means, right? Other sources of evidence. So
Yes. Yes.
certainly there are cases in the book of leaders who are charismatic, who I think pull back the veil in a way that is empowering, because it does help people see certain features of the world that are true and that need reckoning with. I write about Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
and he is certainly someone who, I mean, part of his genius. He's one of a few leaders I write about in the book who senses the anxieties and dynamics of his time, and each era, I suggest, has a kind of dominant charismatic type, a particular style of charismatic storytelling that is especially resonant. And the leaders who actually do the best and maybe land most often on the side of ethical good are not those leaders who lean all the way into the dominant type of their age, but rather respond to it in a more subtle way, use it to diagnose things they need to respond to and address in their constituents, and maybe combine it in a measured way with other approaches to leadership. So in King's case, I place him in the era I call the era of the experts. So it's this period, the 1950s and early 60s, that's kind of a reaction to the trauma of fascism and demagoguery that really sort of conquers the Western mind as a result of World War II,
Yeah.
and the 30s and 40s, that whole period, right? So there is this window in the 50s and 60s when the authority of experts and this kind of sense that you can guide people by making a rational argument about policy and the common good, it has this kind of moment in the sun. It's generally like Americans are very skeptical of institutions and elites, but there's this period where there's a bit of
Huh.
an exception. And so king
Wow.
king sees this, and he sees the anxiety of especially white kind of power brokers in his period about more radical elements in the broad civil rights movement. He has a PhD, right, from Boston University, and he has a distinct ability. He comes from a kind of middle class educated background. An ability to speak in that register of the calm, rational, sober minded person who is just giving you the straight facts. And if you watch some of his early television appearances, his interactions with elites in Washington, this is part of what he's doing, and it's part of what his admirers in the civil rights movement see. He combines this, though, with the Black prophetic tradition, and that really harkens back to an earlier period in my history of charisma. Prophets are more squarely planted in the religious Judeo-Christian prophetic narrative of the cosmos. But that remains, even if it is not kind of gleaming in the same way in the mid 20th century that it was in the colonial period. It remains this really important thread, especially for Black Americans. And King is able to weave that together with his expert charisma, and sometimes lean more
Hmm.
into one than the other, depending on the audience. But always tethered to this broader picture of the world that he is not arguing he is the only way to, but rather he's presenting the prophetic tradition as a broad set of tools for criticizing injustice. And so I think he's an example of someone who we could say uses charisma in this complex way and does so
Hmm.
for good.
For sure. You said Man, the way you explain things is so helpful, and I want to pick up on every little thread and explore all those little paths. But one of the things I want to mention is that, or pick up on, is that you mentioned that, like after World War II, there was this moment where we have like some kind of clarity around the need for experts or just for truth tellers, maybe we can say, because of coming off of fascism and demagogues. And I think a lot of people feel like, and I think I'm one of them because, I grew up I was born in 1988. So I was born after World War II and after a lot of that stuff happened. And for me, watching, I think, the rise of Trump and again, being in that world, we use the F word a lot around here. We use the word fascism a lot, but we also try and be grounded. We try and have experts on to help us understand when we should use it, when we shouldn't, because I think anything can be thrown around too often and kind of not mean anything, right? If fascism is everything, then it's nothing, right? But I do think like there are some there is a cycle maybe that I'm picking up on as you're talking of like, okay, so we had this moment coming out of this other period. And I feel like in history, we're kind of coming back around this bend and maybe exploring what demagogues, in power can or cannot do based on what you just said earlier, where charisma can be used as a positive or negative. We don't have to, for now, we won't use Trump because he's the easy target. I think about talk radio. I think about Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, right? These are these really charismatic speakers who I grew up listening to. Rush Limbaugh in particular. I mean, he pioneered the whole talk radio genre. And I think, in my opinion, that's someone who had a lot of charisma, but used it in ways where a lot of truth was not being told. And I think it created this group of people who somehow were able to merge their Christian faith and like these right-wing talking points. I don't know. It's a weird thing for me to still even express because on one hand, I was taught in those spaces how important truth was, but I was also taught listen to Rush Limbaugh because he's a truth teller. And I look back now and I'm like, I don't know if those things were really compatible. But that's someone I think about, maybe was really charismatic in how he spoke and how he compelled people, but maybe not for the best outcomes.
I'm really glad you bring up Rush Limbaugh. He ended up being a major player in the later part of my book.
Oh,
And I
look
think
at
you're
that.
exactly right. Yeah.
It worked out.
And this is a good example of how I think we make a mistake if we try to diagnose all the dynamics of our current political moment just in terms of the last 15 years
Agreed.
and we make the story of the polarization of the media and people's echo chambers just one of social media and algorithms on Facebook and stuff, because you're absolutely right that all of the patterns that have become more extreme today, they began certainly in the 1990s, they were in full swing, and you can trace them a little bit back even further than that. But Rush Limbaugh is enormously important, and he's important for the last kind of epoch that I treat in my book, which I call the age of the gurus. And this is an age when institutional authority, people's trust in big established institutions ranging from the federal government to kind of mainstream established churches to the mainstream media to higher education really starts to crash. I think people often use the word secularization to describe only a change in the authority of religious institutions. And I think that's a blinkered view of what we're talking about. The trajectory of religious institutions is part of this broader trajectory of the declining authority of institutions, full stop.
Yeah.
And expertise, the credibility of expertise depends on the authority of those institutions. Experts are, by definition, individuals who are trained and credentialed by institutions and answerable to a guild of fellow experts who somehow also have relationships to and are kind of legitimated by these institutions. So as go the institutions, so go the experts. I think Rush Limbaugh's genius was to sense the kind of mounting, and he didn't create this. I think this is already true, certainly by the time he's coming of age in the late 1970s. He is sensing this growing cynicism about institutions. And that's a bipartisan story, right? And it has some familiar causes, the Vietnam War, the kind of backlash and frustration about both the successes of the civil rights movement among some people on the right and also its shortcomings among those on the left, and various trends that are sort of feeding people's changing relationships to traditional churches. Rush Limbaugh comes into all of this, I don't think programmed initially as a devoted servant of ideology. Rather, I think he was at his base someone who was a comedian and kind of a nihilist, who just loved radio as a medium for tearing things down and entertaining people, and that dovetailed with this emerging late 20th century conservative ideology. His pitch to listeners was, you've been fed this barrel of lies
Oh yeah.
by the sellout pinko media,
The
and you
drive-by
should
media. The drive-by
exactly
media.
yeah
I know all the slogans.
he had a genius
Yeah.
for belittling with nicknames, which is something that
yeah.
Trump is so good at, right? The commie pinkos and feminazis.
Feminazis, yes,
right?
yes.
Calling
the way he would talk
the
about
White House.
Reverend. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, it's like the White House during the Clinton years is the
Yes.
Oval Orifice, right?
Yes, yes, or CNN, the Clinton News Network. Like, I know, I'm 36. I still remember all of these. 100%. Yeah, exactly.
But his pitch is that you can trust Rush. Like, he will pull back the veil and tell you the real story. And
Yes.
I got kind of deep into some of the media coverage when Rush was really at his apex, and reporters would go out and interview some of these super fans who would just close down their lives for 3 hours in the afternoon when his show was on, or they would meet at the local restaurant and have Snapple, right, Rush Limbaugh's favorite drink, and like raise a toast and have American flag and this sort of thing. And they would say, we call ourselves ditto heads, like that was their nickname because of the caller who said, ditto what that caller said, right?
Mega dittos.
But they said, we don't blindly follow Rush Limbaugh. He's empowering us. Right. And there is in the way they talk kind of a foreshadowing of that great slogan of our internet age, do your own research, right? Don't trust the experts. Just get on the internet and Google yourself into some corner of craziness, and that's where you will find the truth that's been hidden from you for all this time. So I think Limbaugh really does feed this ecosystem of rhetoric and deep cynicism and skepticism of experts who in previous eras had more authority and more power to kind of counterbalance charismatic challenges.
Yeah, no, well said. I agree with you. I've always said to people, and I've known this for a while, that you don't look at like Ben Shapiro for what happened or how we got here. You look at Rush Limbaugh. You look at that first gen, right? Gen 1 of talk radio. And honestly, I remember I grew up doing construction with my dad, so he had it on all day, all the time. That's how I would know what time of day it was. Okay, if it's Rush, it must be between 12 and 3. If it's Sean Hannity's, it's between 3 and 6, which means the job's almost done and I'm going home soon, right? So that's just how I knew it. And yeah, it was something where I realized I was doing some like amateur research a long time ago, and I saw that like out of the top 10 talk radio, or even just like radio shows on the AM airways, 9 out of 10 were right wing like talk radio shows. And so I think that people don't understand like that your Charlie Kirks, these people, they're just Gen 2.0. They're the next evolution of taking the charisma and the right-wing ideology and just taking it to its next step, which I do think, I think we should at least mention kind of the present moment, because it does seem like, and I would love, again, you're the one who did the research, so I please put this moment in its historical context for us, because a lot of us feel like this is unprecedented in so many ways. And I feel like with social media in particular, and these algorithms and these mega corporations that are just mining data from us, that is unprecedented. But the ingredients of charisma and propaganda and institutional distrust, etc., that's not new. But it does feel like things are reaching a new level, at least in my lifetime. You know, thinking about Rush Limbaugh compared to listening to Charlie Kirk, there's some real differences, and one sounds way less. One sounds way more unbridled than the other, right? Maybe Rush had some of those views, but he would express them a little bit differently, and maybe not so intensely. I hear Charlie Kirk saying, you know, if I see a black pilot, I get scared. I'm like, okay, dude, like you're just saying the quiet parts out loud now. So, you know, you think about your book and you tracing the history of charisma. How do you see charisma being used today, anywhere, whether it's for good, for bad, and like what are its impacts, you think, going through these channels of social media where any kind of charisma can be amplified? In particular, I think the more sky is falling, negative, tearing down charisma is probably preferred by algorithms because they get more engagement. How do you see that kind of playing into all this?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if charisma is premised on a particular kind of storytelling, the algorithms are set up to reward a certain kind of story
Yeah, exactly.
that does, you know, quickly become very extreme. And I think that on one hand, the advent of Donald Trump is a continuation of a very long story, and so in that sense is not unprecedented. But there is kind of a perfect storm in his biography and his
Yeah, yeah,
context that I think
yeah.
does absolutely make him special. And I want to be clear too that, you know, I've spent enough time talking to people who are supportive of Trump to various degrees to know that, you know, his coalition is really complicated, and people have chosen to vote for him for all kinds of reasons, and some certainly holding their nose, you know, maybe because they feel that abortion is absolutely the issue, and changing the composition of the Supreme and federal courts is the number one priority that trumps everything else. And that, frankly, I mean, if that's your view and that's your priority, like it's been a good bargain. I mean,
Yep.
in terms of the sort of quid pro quo.
Yeah.
And evangelicals, you know, they have a long history, like most, maybe all voting demographics, of making pragmatic deals with candidates with whom they don't agree. But I think the real conundrum is is that there was this moment in, you know, 2015 when there were these other choices that did far more naturally line up with a
Yes.
conventional, you know, Christian right picture of morality. So, you know, how is it that evangelical support coalesced around Trump and then has built into the MAGA phenomenon? So
Right.
I think that Trump, um, to understand his appeal, you have to go back really to the beginning of his emergence into the national limelight as a businessman and look at the stories that he was crafting about himself. So if you go back and read his interviews with the New York tabloids, his early appearances on the Oprah show, Larry
Mm-hmm.
King Live, he is talking about how the system is rigged and how he's made his career as an entrepreneur, right? He always emphasized, you know, kind of painted this myth of himself as a self-made man, you know, ignoring, you know, the sizable inherited part of it that he got from his father. But
Self-made,
he
baby.
tell yeah, he would tell a story of his career that emphasized, you know, all of these people who tried to screw me over, and I caught them out and I had my revenge. So he is crafting very early on this story of himself and of the system as totally illegitimate, and himself as this sort of heroic, figure of personal, you know, excellence and savvy and triumph.
Right.
And that story gets supercharged on the eve of his, you know, the proper launch of his political career by the reality show The Apprentice. So I think it really gets stamped on the minds of a wide swath of Americans that, you know, this is who he is. And this is all happening in an era of American history when public trust in institutions has never been lower and is only crashing further. So people are ready for the story that we need to burn it all down. that why should we care about the rule of law when the whole system is illegitimate, right? And on top of this, the Democrats have lost the plot, right? So
Yep.
that's the other side of this. Unprecedented vulnerability on the other side in our kind of very sclerotic two-party system that makes it very
Yep.
hard to challenge dominant narratives even when they're failing. So I think the Democratic Party poured itself into a story that it turns out does not resonate with most Americans, which is the story that divides us up into these little, identity-based, ethnic and racial and sexual identity categories, and makes a separate pitch to each one of us. And it turns out that most Americans don't buy that, and so they were more in the market for an alternative. The other thing I'll mention here is I think Trump's relationship to Christianity is really interesting and complex. And there's maybe sort of three components to it. One
Yeah.
we've mentioned, which is the kind of political realism, the bargain with some of the key priorities of the Christian right. The second is his strategic recognition of an underutilized demographic, which is the independent charismatic churches.
Yes.
And
Matthew
he
Taylor's a good friend of the show. Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
so I love his book. And
Yep.
Trump didn't come to that lately. I mean, he called Paula White
Yeah,
up in
exactly.
2002, right? When he saw
Exactly.
her show. Now, that leads us to ask, well, what accounts for that early affinity? And I think it's crucial to not lose sight of the fact that while Trump is not an Orthodox Christian by any reasonable measure, he
Right.
did grow up listening to the preaching of Norman Vincent Peale in his
Yes.
family church, Marble Collegiate Church. So he was shaped by the godfather of positive thinking prosperity gospel. And
Right.
this message that you can reshape reality, you can create new facts with the power of your mind. Now, I think most of the time, Trump believes his own
Yeah.
propaganda. He is reshaping reality, he's conjuring it into existence. And the more I study the history of American spirituality, the more I am persuaded that that prosperity gospel, what we might broadly call the kind of new thought tradition, which is broader than just Christianity,
Yep.
this whole
Definitely.
family of spiritual traditions from transcendentalism, to theosophy, Christian science, and
Hmm.
science of mind, all of these things premised on the idea that there is kind of a divine energy that you can align yourself with, and you can
Yes.
reshape reality through a set of interventions. Uh, it is this persistent and incredibly influential strain in American spirituality that Trump has tapped into because it's actually the tradition in which he was raised in
Hmm.
important ways. And he comes by that honestly, if
Yeah.
I can say that. So I think all of these factors have kind of come together in Trump to account for his political success.
I mean, what is it? The book, The Secret, I think is one of the most like well known like versions of that, right? That you can just kind of manifest these realities, the power of positive thinking. And look, I mean, I think like anything, there is something that resonates, maybe that is somewhat truthful about the idea of like, hey, like positive thinking is a good thing, and like, hey, what you put your mind to, you can try and make happen. But of course, there's a lot of noise and garbage between that reality and what a lot of these people push. And also, on a side note, audience, I have seen a big connection between multi-level marketing and that type of thinking. I don't know why, but like I've just seen it in my own life. Like there's this weird like self-made positive energy manifests your people in that world. But yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. As you're talking about this, I'm like yes, 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 yes. I'm wondering, so I guess my question is like, I agree with you, by the way, that like storytelling often is way more powerful than just facts, right? I think this is one of the problems that people like myself have is I'm like, look, this is data. People are like, yeah, but that story is more compelling, right? And I'm like, but that story is not true. And I'm thinking about, I'm not sure if you know who Scott Coley is. He wrote a really good book called The Ministers of Propaganda. Great book. He talks about this idea of legitimizing narratives. And there are narratives that people tell themselves that legitimizes a certain hierarchy or structure in a society where those people are at the top and everyone else is at the bottom. It could be around anything. And I'm thinking about that idea along with the propaganda and charisma and how they're all kind of put together to create this story that a lot of people believe, even if it's not serving their own interest, right? I mean, this is a problem that I think MLK pointed out of the poor white working class, right? And how the conservative dilemma often is, how do you convince the majority of people to vote for you, to a degree anyway, even though a lot of your policies might actually go against their own economic interests when it comes to maybe tax cuts, etc. And I'm wondering, what is your thought, and maybe you talk about this in the book, so how do we offer a better story that's also rooted in charisma, but also in truth telling, that is more compelling for people to believe than whatever it is that we're seeing being offered as the predominant narrative right now, right? Because I do agree with you, and this might make some people upset or whatever, it is what it is. Like, I was not thrilled with the Democratic response to Trump. I don't think Joe Biden was super compelling. I get, like, we survived. Like, he did a fine job, okay. But, like, my gosh, like, the way that whole thing fell apart, it was a real... It was not a compelling offer, frankly, okay? Even though I have my thoughts on that, I get how the average American is like, what are you guys doing, right? And so I'm just kind of curious for you, like, what do you think, like, how do we get out of this and offer people a better narrative, but rooted in things that are loving and justice-oriented, et cetera?
I appreciate your question because it's important to stress that calling something a story doesn't necessarily mean it's made up, right?
Right,
Like, stories can be assembled and rooted in facts, and they do give people a structure for prioritizing certain facts over others. But we have to do that. That's how we make our way through the world, right? Like,
right,
it's just a matter of which stories, not whether you have stories that are your kind of operative lens. I think our problem is that our ecosystem of ways of getting as close as we can to what I'll call the asymptote of reality, right? Because we all have our perspective, we all have limited information. We
yep,
can't, have all the facts of the universe in our brains organized at once, right? All we can do is work together as a society to get closer and closer to that asymptote. We need a lot of different tools that check and balance each other to do that. That's what I mean when I talk about the ecosystem. And it needs to involve charismatic kind of flamethrower, system disturbers. I think they are a useful, powerful presence in a healthy ecosystem, but only if we also have kind of established, boring, somewhat bureaucratic institutions
right.
that have the resources to do fact checking, that have the ability to educate the populace on how you navigate all of these different media sources, and what it looks like to investigate a factual claim, how to at least be aware of your echo chamber, even if very few of us actually have the bandwidth or the emotional energy to seek out lots and lots of different perspectives, even especially those we disagree with, because those
Right.
agitate us so much. But I think that our task is restoring that balance. And frankly, I put a significant amount of responsibility and blame on my own guild, higher mainstream secular higher education. I think we are in crisis. We have lost the trust of huge swaths of America. A lot of the conservative criticisms of universities are very close to, if not bang on, true. So there is absolutely a serious ideological imbalance. There is a real question about the return on investment because of how expensive education has become, and so it's no wonder that our students are more and more skeptical of classes in the humanities that can ground you in a broader view of the cosmos and ultimate questions and so forth. If they don't see a one-to-one correlation to a salary at the other end because they're often spending so much money, I think the priorities have gotten so out of whack. So I think part of the solution is a real self renovation. I would love to see, I guess, both universities and churches lean into their respective countercultural jobs. So it seems to me that part of the problem is that both these sets of institutions have
Mm.
gotten sucked into and compromised by worldly demands of the market and hunger for political power, and they have forgotten their roots in a very different call and a very different witness. So in the case of the university, sure, universities are supposed to be spaces of innovation and job preparation, absolutely, but they're also supposed to be medieval countercultural homes for the pursuit of knowledge that doesn't necessarily have an obvious cash value at the other end. They're supposed to nurture students in analog critical thinking that
Mm.
involves reading long books and writing long essays without the help of a chatbot. And that's actually their value and the way they add ballast in this kind of ecosystem of truth gathering that we're talking about. Churches, I think, have that abiding paradox, right, of being in the world but not of it. And I do think that there is a swath, and you've talked a lot about this on your show, of conservative, majority white Christianity that has become enamored with political power at too high a cost,
Yeah.
and has perhaps allowed a certain story about the culture that is about their loss of cultural status, the kind of swirl of change that they don't have control over. I think that's perhaps gained too much control over their picture of the country and truly of what's happening worldwide, right? Because even if it can feel to members of conservative churches right now like conservative Orthodox Christianity is kind of on the ropes in the United States, if you zoom out, we're in the middle of a worldwide Christian revival. And Christianity has never been, it's not in its origins a Western white religion. And it is certainly not majority Western and white today, right? So I think leaning into what has always been the global story of Christianity is a way of regaining some perspective and an ability to evaluate the stories that different charismatic leaders who purport to be Christian are telling.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I would love to, and maybe we'll get you back on the show and kind of unpack some of those things, because when it comes to like even higher education, it's really tough, Molly, because I don't want to come across as a fundamentalist all over again, where I'm trying to leave fundamentalism behind and be more curious, and also at the same time, like because I spend so much time tracking Christian nationalism. I've been to America Fest hosted by Turning Point USA. Like I'm in that world just to understand it better. I hear so much about the attack, or how bad, a college education is, or how it's not worth anything. And so I'm always trying to find the balance, because someone like yourself, who obviously is credible, you're not Charlie Kirk. When you say something like, hey, some of these critiques are bang on, I'm like, okay, that gives me pause. Because if Charlie said, I'd be like, okay, Charlie, I don't really care. But because you're saying it, I'm like, wait, I have more questions about that. I think that's important, right? We have to be able to be able to self-reflect even on things that, might be true that we're not willing to, on the surface, maybe accept or even understand at first. And the other point I think I want to make is, I definitely struggle with, in particular, the white evangelical church for so many reasons. And one of them is, I mean, this is data now. I'm quoting PRRI. It's very clear that white evangelicals have been in the tank for Trump since the beginning. Even over the past 100 days of his presidency recently, 72% of white evangelicals saying he's doing a bang up job. And I'm like, what? Like, again, like, what are you looking at? And I think what's been frustrating to me is to see what I call as the American Christian persecution complex on display for so long. These people who have truly unprecedented access to serious political power, worship services in the White House. Paula White has her own office in the White House. And so many of these people, and I met them, I track them, I go to their events, insist that they're just on the verge of being persecuted for their faith, which usually, not always, but usually revolves around not letting gay people have the same access to rights that they have. And that's when I get fired up. I'm like, look, I get it. You're going to have your theological convictions around things. I understand that. But we don't live in a theocracy, thank God. And people have a right to exist in ways that maybe you don't like in a multicultural pluralistic society. And so I think that both of those things, I just want to highlight as you're talking, like, I definitely agree with you on all of this. And also I struggle with, like, and maybe we can wrap up on this question, but here's where I really struggle with all of this is, what do you do when there are people in this country who are not interested in playing ball with people that they disagree with, right? And I'm not talking about the average conservative. There's a big distinction between Christian nationalism and conservatism. And Christian nationalists, by research, show they are not interested in working together. They view the other side as demon infested. And, demons are not redeemable. The whole point of something being a demon is that you destroy it. And I think that's where I'm always struggling these days, is like, I'm with you in all of this stuff. And also I feel like we're facing a really big threat from, frankly, Christian zealots who believe that they've been given a mandate by God, a seven mountain mandate, some might even say, to take over, the nation and to rule from the top down. How do you navigate that kind of militant theology in a way that doesn't dehumanize them, but also takes a stand for something and says, you know what? There is a truth here, and you're on the wrong side of this part of history. That's where I struggled the most, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's in some ways like the problem of
Oh,
our current moment in public discourse. I guess I read and engage with these conversations about Christian nationalism with a great deal of caution, because
hmm.
I think the tools that social scientists especially have been using to try to identify and quantify Christian nationalists are incredibly flawed. I mean, if you look
Oh,
at a lot of these surveys,
hmm.
they are asking respondents to assent to what are really very basic points of faith, right? That I think taken out of context, and especially when heard by uninformed secular people, sound crazy. Like, do you believe in prophecy? Well, yeah, like that. That's a sort of mainstream Christian view, right? And I guess as a humanist, I'm always skeptical of these survey instruments, because every question makes me want to dig down and ask, well, what do you mean? And even if we
Sure.
just take a sort of subculture like the New Apostolic Reformation,
Mm-hmm.
I've spent some time working on an essay about this, interviewing pastors at a church here in the Triangle that affiliates with the New Apostolic Reformation, but really holds politics at arm's length, and is, one of the most diverse churches in the state, and is really kind of international in its vision. And so I think the way in which some commentators collapse a story about white supremacy and a fairly kind of narrow theological view with this broader, like, really complicated world of independent charismatic networks
Yeah.
creates more confusion than it solves. So I think part of the first task, if you're trying to engage with people who are affiliated or you think are affiliated with some part of this, is to, I think, just go into question asking mode, because there is so much internal diversity here, and
Yeah.
you may find points of connection and agreement that surprise you. So I mean, that's the first thing. But you're absolutely right. Like, there is, of course, some segment of the population, and we can debate about the size of it, with whom maybe it is fruitless to try to have civil dialogue, right? And in that case, and I'll just tell you my own kind of strategy to kind of try to not feel entirely useless in this political moment, and that is to try to engage with and elevate, like, the huge swath of people in the middle who are either kind of minority voices in their churches, Or, like I would say my own church is a really complicated church, like full of Republicans and Democrats, that's trying to sort of thread the political needle and call both, however you vote, call people to like really a critical prophetic Christian witness, to your side, whichever side that is. And so, if you've exhausted your efforts and your patience with a certain more extreme segment of the public, of your interlocutors, then turn to what is frankly the much larger population of people who are not interested in the extremes, and who I think are more open to connection, than maybe we give them credit for, and invest your time there.
Can I ask you one more question, if you don't mind? And you don't have to answer this. We can always edit this part out. But I have to ask, and I mean this in very good faith. I'm just so curious. I'm with you, by the way. Let me say, I agree with the premise. But the reality is that the majority of white Christians, Catholics, Protestants, and evangelicals voted for an extreme man doing extreme things. And that's what I struggle with. Like the fact that we are literally ripping 2-year-old children away from their parents and sending them to different countries, even though they're U.S. citizens. I don't understand the fact that Elon Musk gave a Nazi salute at Trump's inauguration party, and people were like, "Well, he was giving his heart out." I'm like, I don't understand what is happening, and that's where I struggle. Was I don't disagree with your premise at all. That yes, most people are probably in the middle, but I do think the data is accurate here. Like many different pollsters show that white Protestant Christians and Catholics and evangelicals voted for a dude who was doing, I would argue, crazy things. You know what I mean? In 2020, the man incited insurrection. And I'm not, that's where I get stuck there. Just speaking frank with you, just host to guest. I get stuck in that moment because I get that, but also the fruit of these actions have very extreme outcomes. And it seems like, and I'm just giving you my perspective as someone who admittedly is biased, but also who grew up in this world my whole life and was all the way in, there's a lack of repentance I see from this group when it comes to their own actions that cause so much damage to other people in the political realm.
Can
That
I ask
hurts.
you, can I ask you, why do you think that every non-white demographic swung more toward Trump in the most recent election than the last one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think besides black women, I think they were the only one who didn't really swing a whole lot. I think that that's a question I'm still trying to answer and understand. I mean, obviously it happened, but I love good faith dialogue like this, so don't mind me. I enjoy this, but I still think that, from my understanding, even though there were gains in those demographics, it was still white Christians that were the biggest group by far that voted for Trump, and that's been a consistent. I mean, that's since Reagan, right? Since Reagan, we've seen this pattern. That's what I'm, as Christians, right? Christian witness. That's what I'm thinking about. Is like, I read Jesus, and Jesus says, "Love your enemies," and this world that Trump embodies largely says, you should crucify your enemies. We should go after our enemies. They are vermin. They are poisoning the blood of society. This stuff. And I'm like, I don't understand that. That's what I don't get.
I agree with you. I think he is a pagan president far more than he is. I mean, he's not Christian. He's pagan.
Right.
I guess. I think that the most useful way to try to navigate this is to really appreciate that humans are incredibly complicated and often internally contradictory
Yeah.
creatures.
That's
and
true.
and one of the big lessons to me of the last election is that the things that were like the major headlines for a lot of the people in my milieu and kind of secular left-leaning academia,
Yeah.
namely that this candidate is a threat to the rule of law and like the fundamentals of American institutions, that had exactly zero purchase
Yep.
on the vast majority of voters who
Yep.
are much more focused on the cost of eggs.
Right.
And hearing these things about like all these immigrants pouring across the border, and maybe paying some attention to the very real problem of governance in left dominated democratic cities, which are like basically failed states, many of them.
Mm.
So the way
Yeah.
you assemble your picture of reality and then evaluate the proposals of these candidates, right? There's often just an enormous chasm
Yeah.
between, how different citizens do this, right?
Hmm.
And most of us are low information in one way or another.
Yeah. Sure.
I can't. All I can do is affirm. I mean, I share your frustration, but like at a certain point, um, rending garments and like shaking our heads, like it's sort of pointless.
Yeah.
And I guess it's more
Yeah.
interesting and productive to just try to understand these other perspectives.
For sure. No, I'm with you there, Molly. I mean, that's why we have the podcast, always trying to unpack, how this stuff works, because I think a lot of us continually seem to be bewildered. Again, not by the fact that people do bad things or that we're contradictory. We get that. It just is very strange watching my faith tradition be so emphatic behind this stuff sometimes. That part still, I'm like, I'm trying to understand, read Jesus, see action. But to your point, I also understand that the alternative isn't always compelling for people, and I get why. Like, I don't misunderstand me, and same for the audience. Like, I'm not saying like, well, Democrats are going to save the country. I think that there's a huge reckoning happening in those spaces right now as well, between like this populist leftist movement and like the establishment, and there's issues there, which I think goes back to what you were saying earlier of kind of this perfect storm, right? Of like there was really no other alternative for a lot of Americans who have these different views and how they get their media. It's like you said, it's complicated. But I would love to have you back on again, because I think you're such a compelling guest, and you're so knowledgeable, and your perspectives I think are needed, because we have to figure this out, right? I mean, I think one thing that all of us agree on is that we want to find a way to make the world a better place for all of our neighbors and for future generations, right? And that's easier said than done. And that requires, I think, being very intentional about how we think about this stuff. So I really appreciate making time, because it was really great.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Good. I'm so glad. Friends, the book is Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, written by Molly Worthen. It was so great. Let's keep in touch. We'll do it again. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
You got it.